The Bear Essentials podcast gives older bears a place to gather for real talk regarding topics and issues that they can relate to. Here at The Bear Essentials, we aren't just having conversations. We are looking to provide actionable intelligence through real-life experience and expertise of our guests. Our mission is to build a strong community that elevates and motivates people to go beyond their limiting beliefs by helping them realize that getting older is not an excuse to hibernate on their goals, but a reason to work harder.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Charles Wallace. Today's guest is an adventurer, a mountaineer, who has had 2 attempts at Mount Everest. And during one of those attempts, he actually survived one of the biggest disasters in the history of Nepal, the Nepal earthquake of 2015. Besides that, he has written 2 books, and despite suffering from childhood epilepsy and a stammer, he is a motivational speaker. This young man has accomplished so much, and his goal in life is to help others seek out and to conquer their own Everest. So please, without further ado, let's welcome Alex Staniforth to the show. But first, a word from our sponsor. Wolfinger Consulting. Experts who have achieved real results for their clients, including complying efficiently and successfully with overwhelming discovery orders, passing difficult third-party security audits, and deploying bleeding-edge technology platforms to control and preserve corporate information. Let them show you what Wolfinger Consulting can do for you. Be sure to check out their webpage at wolfingerforensics.com. Hi, Alex. How you doing? Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Charles, as well. Yeah, looking forward to having a chat and sharing some adventures.
Yeah, I think again, I'm just a tiny bit older than you, but I think it's really, really impressive. Someone of your young age, some of the things you've done, and I really feel like for all of us, we can all learn from each other regardless of age. So I think it's great to have someone even a little bit younger, because you're quite accomplished in my opinion. And I think what we'll talk about will really inspire the audience and help a lot of people. So I'm really looking forward to it.
It's great. Thank you.
All right. So that being said, would you mind introducing yourself? A little brief introduction here for the audience.
Sure, I'll try and keep it brief. I'm Alex Staniforth. I describe myself as an adventurer, ultra runner, a motivational speaker, author, and I'm a founder of a mental health charity. And I'm based in Kendal in the south, which is in the South Lake District in the UK. I'm from Chester originally, but I moved here about 4 years ago, just to be in the mountains, to be in my happy place, really. And yeah, that's the brief overview, and obviously we can dive into that later.
Yeah, and even with the brief overview, you touched on a lot of topics that I really, are near and dear to me as far as messages I'm really trying to get across here with the podcast. So looking forward to it. I think we'll touch on a lot of it. And again, I think the audience is in for a treat. And I think your story and the things you've done will really, really resonate with people. So you mentioned, a lot of things there in the introduction, author, adventure, you mentioned mental health. Let's start. I know you're not that old, but let's go back a little bit to younger. When you say adventure, growing up, could you tell us a little bit about your childhood that maybe has taken you the path that you've gone down and where you are now? How's your childhood impacted that?
Definitely. As you mentioned, as you touched on, I'm still fairly young, 27, and I didn't really discover the adventure, the outdoors, until I was around 14. So about 13 years ago, which isn't that long, kind of relatively speaking. But what got me into adventure, I think, was a need for belonging. It was a need for finding new ways of kind of dealing with life and overcoming challenges. And I had a pretty normal start. I was really lucky that my parents gave me everything I needed. It wasn't until I was about 9 years old that changed. So I had a mild form of epilepsy, which was brought under control by medication, and it's not an issue since, fortunately. but was just the catalyst for a whole host of different challenges like anxiety and panic attacks. I was badly bullied all the way through school because I was different. I've had a stammer all my life, which sometimes can be so bad that I've smashed up phones at home in frustration of being unable to say my own name. A few years ago, I couldn't even do a live podcast or a live interview because my speech was that bad. And I've always struggled with words beginning with C and K, which isn't ideal when you're from Kelsall and now live in Kendall. And maybe that's why I haven't climbed Kilimanjaro. But I think all these things put together, I also, just to add to that, I hated sports at school. I hated exercise. I hated PE. I remember coming second to last in cross country in our first year. So I guess childhood was quite challenging. I mean, easier than some for sure, but quite a lot to deal with, and especially the anxiety and the panic attacks is quite a lot to go through when you're kind of trying to figure out the world and trying to find your place in that. And I found the outdoors pretty much by chance, really. When I was 14, I was invited hill walking in the Lake District with my friend Tom and his family, and that was something I'd never done before. I'd always been brought up in nature. From a young age, me and my family used to walk the dogs in the forests, on the beaches, and we used to go away to North Wales. But nothing really adventurous as I know it now. But the outdoors kind of became this safe space. It became a way to express myself in the way I'd never been able to prove myself, to prove the bullies wrong. And I finally found the confidence, the passion, and the drive that I'd never had at school. And I wasn't afraid of being different anymore. It's not an overnight process. It was that initial walk, then it was paragliding on holiday, then it was, I'll tell you a story about how I got into running. My dad was a marathon runner. He's ran London Marathon a few times. And my stepmom put a bet whilst we were on holiday in France that I couldn't go for a 1 mile run with my dad. Now, back then, that seemed a long way, and €2 was a lot of money back then. So I moaned and complained and whinged, but I dragged myself around. And it was that mindset shift of actually, I can do that. What else can I do? And that's kind of led me to where I am. But in summary, the outdoors kind of is where I really found myself.
Alex, I obviously, before we jumped on here today, I've watched some of your talks, and I, delved in a little bit to some of the things you've done. And just hearing you talk about it, though, your childhood and some of the things you experienced, it was actually going through my mind as you were speaking. Compliment to you. I was sitting here saying, wow, he is so well spoken, so polished. And it's really incredible to consider from where you considered yourself to be to now. Like it's an amazing thing. And I know we're going to get into some of the adventures, but I mean, just hearing about some of the stuff you went through at a young age and that you pushed through and got yourself through, again, kudos to you, because, I'm really, really impressed with you. And again, I think at your age, your young age, it's even more impressive. So when you talk about the adventures, and you mentioned the outdoors being your safe space, now you've done some really incredible outdoorsy things. And I think one of the things that really was a highlight to me was, I think everybody always thinks about the completion of a task or things like that. And sometimes we don't necessarily consider the effort that goes into it and the things that have happened. So that was one of the things I wanted to get into with you, was that you started one of the speeches I've seen you give, one of your talks, about talking about Everest. And I want to let you get into it more, because it's not the typical, I'll call it, Everest story. So would you mind talking a little bit about what you did as far as Everest at a really, even a younger age?
Yeah, so I was 18 when I went out my first attempt on Everest on a summit expedition, because when you mention Everest at that age, people think, oh, you mean base camp? And I'm like, no, I was trying to get to the top. Although, as it happens, it turned out to be probably the most expensive base camp trek in Everest history, because I think to go back before that, Everest became the ultimate goal at 14. I kind of set sights on that, and I decided that climbing Everest was it. That was the end goal. That was what I wanted to do and to be. That was a way of really kind of finding peace with myself. So subconsciously over 4 years, I was putting steps in place towards making that a reality. And then in 2014, finally joined a commercial expedition, flew out to Nepal on a 2-month trip to actually try and realize that goal. A day before we got to base camp, there was a huge avalanche, which sadly killed 16 Sherpas. The biggest disaster in Everest history at the time. So we had to pack up and go home without actually getting to step foot on a mountain. Now, obviously, we had no right to complain when we're going home safe to our families. After all, the biggest success is safety. Went back the following year, and I guess there was never any doubt that I was going to have to go back. You'd put so much into it by that point, and you just have to find the opportunity. And okay, I've got another year to go home to train harder. And at this point, I dropped all my offers at university, so I didn't really have much choice but to go back. The following year didn't go much better. We were just climbing through to Camp 1 for the first time. We were just above the icefall when the earthquake hit Nepal. And we were trapped up at Camp 1 for 2 days, not realizing that we were just a tiny part in this global disaster, that had taken over 9,000 lives. So that's as far as I've got on Everest, and ultimately two big failures, and lots and lots of life lessons from that. Lots of life lessons. I think at that age, you realize that how fragile life really is, that we're all on borrowed time, only we can take responsibility for that. And you realize what's important, it doesn't mean I don't have the bad days and I get, angry about simple things, but when you've in what is basically a near-death experience at 19, you don't get too stressed when the bus is late or when somebody cuts you up on the road, and it really gives you a chance to evaluate. And I'm glad I got that perspective. I'm really grateful for that. But despite that massive failure, actually, it just opened up so many other doors. We're often so focused on the outcome that we forget about the journey to get there. And actually, the outcome, the end of the summit day, is just a tiny fraction of this entire learning journey. And people love a disaster story. So since then, I've been speaking a lot about it. Motivational speaking has become my main work. I've written 2 books now, started a charity. So many other things came out of that actually you realize that failure is nothing to be afraid of. It's just about how we respond to it.
Yeah, Alex, and that's wow. So like you kind of say so much there in just that little bit. So when I think about what that kind of did for you, if we go back to when it's kind of there in the moment, what's kind of happening at that point in your head? Because now like you said, you've taken that and you've turned it into so much positive, but especially at 19 and understanding some of the things you've been through at even a younger age, through your childhood, what did you know what was kind of happening in the moment when when the disaster, when the earthquake was happening?
Thinking back to it, I mean, it's 8 years ago this week at time of recording, which is crazy. At the time, I didn't actually realize that there'd been an earthquake. I just remember hearing this big crack, which was the sound of ice breaking off the mountain. So I didn't actually realize there's an earthquake. The rest of my team were just amazed at that because they'd been in the tent and it felt like they were on this giant bouncy castle. Just everything was just bouncing. And I was so tired that day moving into Camp 1 that I didn't actually feel that. When the avalanche came through, I mean, we got hit by a big blast of powder in the Western Cone. And when that hit, you just assume the worst. I assumed that I was gone. And pretty miraculously, it was just a big blast of powder. The debris, the ice, never came through. But after that point, after the avalanche, it was just shock. I just went into survival mode. I think I just shut down, and everybody responds differently to that. Some people are really proactive. Some people can take hold of the situation. I just shut down. I mean, you can't train for that. You can train for everything else, but I don't think anybody can really prepare for a situation of that scale. But we didn't realize the full extent of this. I mean, everyone knew there'd been an earthquake, and then obviously that had triggered a big avalanche into Camp 1 and the Western Coombe, and avalanches from all sides. It wasn't until we got on the radio down to base camp and we contacted Henry, our base camp manager, and I was kind of listening in from my tent, and there's all this commotion outside. I just heard the panic in his voice, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was like chaos, carnage. It's all gone. It's all gone. And we're all like, how is it gone? What's on? Then we heard that 2 of our teammates down at base camp had died, and there was one who was in a pretty bad way. And all this happened so quickly. And when he said like base camp had gone, you just can't imagine it being gone. How is it gone? Well, where's it gone? And that was when we understood that actually base camp was a much bigger hit. We didn't know whether anyone was coming for us. We didn't know whether there's anybody there. You can't comprehend it. Of course, you can't comprehend it. And I remember calling home on my satellite phone about half an hour after the avalanche hit, and my mum was all really excited and relieved to hear from me. She was, oh, hey, how's it going? How are you feeling? How's your head? Where are you up to? At this point, it hadn't even broken on global news. So I remember saying to her, look, there's been a slight problem. And like, she was crying and shouting and swearing at me down the phone, and I felt completely helpless. And then, of course, it broke on the news, and then everybody back home went into a panic because there was a big earthquake in Nepal, avalanche in Everest. Everyone panics. But it wasn't until we flew down to base camp 2 days later that we actually knew what the scale of what had happened. Base camp had been hit by a much bigger avalanche, which came down off the side of the peaks around the camp, and 22 people sadly died.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. I kind of remember that day, and I'll be honest, I never really thought I'd be sitting here talking to somebody who was there and hearing you describe it, trying to put myself in your shoes and where you're at. And also as a parent, as you were just telling that last part, I started to think about my own children. If I was listening to my own child on the other end, telling me this, that being said, as you've continued on with some adventures, have you ever gotten any resistance now from your parents? Have they ever been a little bit like, I was too close of a call, even for you, right? Have you ever had that in you where, it was a really close call? Has it ever frightened you or had you hesitate about doing any of the future endeavors that you have done or ones that you're considering?
Great question. And I think firstly on the parents thing, I'm an only child, which may or may not help. I'm really lucky that my parents have always been really supportive. I mean, initially when I mentioned the idea, they're obviously a bit nervous. My dad said it was a lot of money for a holiday, and I think until they realized how committed I was, they thought it was just some stupid phase. We all go through those when you're a teenager. Until actually, like, oh, blimey, this is happening. I think adversity, trauma always brings us closer together in the end. And initially, there was quite a lot of resistance within my family. There was, when I even mentioned about going back, there was a lot of anger. But as I've gone on to find new challenges and new things, they've been right behind me. And when I floated the idea of going back, considering going back, I haven't properly mentioned it yet. I don't think it's going to go down well, but at the same time, I think parents want their kids to achieve their potential. They want them to be happy, and they know that they're not going to stop me. And that's not about being stubborn. It's just about, now I realize how much we need to be free to pursue our dreams. And so I don't think they would stop me. I think obviously there'd be a lot more nerves, but they've seen me do many, many other things. And they've been part of the support team, even if they're not adventurous themselves. So there's definitely been resistance, and the people close to them step parents and friends and family have been angry towards me for putting them through that. I mean, obviously it was never my intention to end up in 2 avalanches. So there's that. And then I think personally, I mean, there's no fear about going back to Everest. There is still an element of trauma. I don't know whether going back there would be too raw. But I feel like it wouldn't affect my mindset. But certain adventures definitely have an impact on me. I mean, I was paragliding last year. I've been trying to learn to paraglide, and I was caught up in, well, I was training with somebody who sadly passed away in a very freak incident. And that has actually affected me a lot more. Seeing somebody, that happened to somebody in front of me, when you're just flying together, and then the next thing you're, seeing all that, that has really put me off flying again. And it's because I think there's a bit of trauma there, and you need to be able to, when you're flying, you need to be mentally in the game, and I don't want to risk being in the air and having a panic attack or something. Whereas in the mountain, I spend so much time in the mountains that I can find peace with them. So it doesn't make you more risk averse. I think it just makes you respect the risk a lot more.
Yeah, and I had to smile when you mentioned the story, because I hadn't thought of that angle, but now that you mentioned it, I think if one of my children had mentioned going to Everest, my first reaction would be, yeah, that's a lot of money. Or I guess you're paying for it because I'm not.
Yeah, and that was my approach too. I mean, my parents have always brought me up to work hard. They weren't going to sign me a check.
Yeah.
It was down to me. I think that's why they didn't believe I was going to make it. But that Everest has an unfair reputation that it's all rich people. There's actually a lot of normal people there that have just committed to Everest to make it happen, off their own backs.
Yeah. So there's obviously the whole Everest, all that you've accomplished with Everest. Some of your other accomplishments, though, I've had a decent amount of authors on the show, and it's funny because whether during the interview or after the interview, a lot of times they'll say, writing a book was one of the hardest things I've ever done. People that haven't written a book, I don't know, what they consider how hard that is. I've never written a book. But hearing other people talk about it, that's a huge accomplishment, I feel, for you. How difficult was that? How challenging was that, Alex?
It was actually pretty straightforward, I think. It's just a process. You just got to keep doing it. Although that's probably not quite correct, because half the challenge is, I guess it depends how you define, publishing a book. Anybody could self-publish anything they want without any need for a publisher or an agent, or, they can do that. But it depends on what you kind of would define as a, successful book. And I was just very, very fortunate by kind of serendipity that in the build to Everest, I managed to secure, I managed to kind of get, kind of a book. It was trying to actually get, a company in the US who were, they were kind of a book, can't speak now. They were like a publishing house. That's it. And they actually contacted me before the trip. And so I kind of had a book lined up before I even went to Everest. So they were based, they were based in the States. And, at 18, you think you've hit the jackpot. You really do, because getting a publisher is the hardest part of the process, because so many people want to write books. And it's very hard to find anything that they're willing to invest in and market. And, you have to really stand out. And so obviously when the first trip went wrong, the book was okay. It was the story of one failure, come back, and then submit. That's the book. And then when that obviously went wrong the second time, I thought I'd lost the book as well. I thought, oh, well, who's going to want to hear about this? Before I even got home, I got an email off them in the States, and the publisher said, actually, this is an even better story now, because you've been involved in 2 freak events in 2 years. And I'd like to think that's the case. It's a more interesting, important story, because everybody's told about how to succeed. How often are we taught about how to fail? And how often do we learn about that? So Icefall kind of came about before I came up with that name, just top of my head. It seemed very appropriate. And as soon as I got home from Everest, we kind of adapted the brief. I worked with them on that, and it came out in March 2016. So it was actually quite straightforward. I think the publishing process first time round was quite basic compared to a typical book. Normally you have to send a manuscript out to hundreds of people. Then it's getting signed off and everything else, and then there's the editing and all that. But basically, I always had a book contract before sending a manuscript, which is quite unconventional. And I spent 6 months working on that. I mean, I was fortunate at the time that I was still at home. Speaking kind of started to take off, but other than that, I was able to spend a lot of time working just on that. And it was really therapeutic. It was really cathartic to be able to almost get all this stuff out of my head and onto paper. And because I had kind of free reign of the kind of content and the flow, it was almost just like a chronological autobiography, which made it a lot easier, and because it was all very fresh in my mind. So I had a deadline by the end of the year, which I hit. And actually, I love the process because I've always wanted to write a book. I've always loved writing. With my stammer, I've always preferred writing because I can properly say what I want to say. And it was fine. And then there was about a year of obviously all the publishing, and then the launch events and all the book signings and talks. And Icefall is still my favorite book. The second one was a lot more challenging because I had like a proper kind of, I had like a more conventional publishing house. So, I've got an agent now. So they were managing, trying to find the best, fit. There was writing proposals, writing submissions, and all that jazz. So that was a much longer process. But as an author from a career perspective, I've got a great agent in Nick and David, and they have been amazing. They really have. And I think that's what's made it more sustainable. But the second book was an absolute chore to write. It was a chore to write. I think partially because it was a much more complex story, but also it was very open about mental health. And while I was in that, it was quite hard to be writing about it all the time, having a deadline, having a much more bigger investment, having editors, having all this sort of thing. And I think as well, the first book is exciting. The second one, it's almost the kind of novelty wears off a bit. It's a very different book. I do enjoy writing, but I think it's a lot of time and effort, and you have to be able to commit that. And I do want to write a third and many more books. It's just now I'm just too busy now. So yeah, so sorry, it's a very long-winded way of saying I love the process, but when it's forced, it can be a real challenge.
And Alex, it's a good segue because I wanted to get into talking a little bit about mental health. It's definitely a topic that we've addressed, on my show. And I think it's such an important topic because I think especially for, I think men even more, right? We have a tendency to kind of, stay silent. We will suffer in silence. And, when I think back to things that you've done and what you've been through, when do you start to think about, because I think everybody can go through things, but then I think it takes a special individual like yourself who decides, what, I'm now going to take my experiences and what I've been through, and I'm going to use that to highlight a cause and to help others. When for you does it kind of become, what, I think I want to become almost an advocate for mental health and look to use my story to help others?
I think initially when I was doing challenges and when I started to find that world, I'd always done them to raise money for a cause. My grandma kind of instilled that into me from a young age, and it just felt the right thing to do because you're doing something as an opportunity to raise money. Otherwise, it just feels like a bit of a personal mission. So I'd always done that, but the focus kind of changed because after Everest, I had a bit of kind of a midlife crisis at 19, and I was thinking around this case of, if I'd been in that tent on Everest at base camp, what would I have left behind? This case of actually it's all about just reaching a mountain, and then you put the flag on the top, and then what's next? It's always what's next, what's next, what's next. This need for kind of constant pushing the bar. I think challenging ourselves is really important and always will be, but it's about having that why, and it's almost, how can I make a bigger difference close to home? So after Everest all went pear-shaped and I saw the people in Nepal who've lost everything, it was a case of, right, what can I do? How can I make something good out of this? And the speaking and the writing was never really planned as such. It just kind of happened, because I realized it was a gift. I had an obligation to our teammates who died to make something good out of this. I had an obligation to share that story. And after carrying the Olympic torch, 2012, my old primary school invited me to come and speak to other kids. Now, speaking to 200 kids when you have a stammer is like the worst possible nightmare, and especially kids are really unforgiving. They tell you what they think. But I did it, and I found actually I loved it. I loved the buzz of it, and it was that feeling of overcoming those self limitations. After that talk, I remember getting an email from one of the parents telling me that their kid had been running around the garden with a coat hanger above their head, pretending to be like Alex in the Olympic torch. And it's just those things that you realize, actually, if I talk about this, I can make a difference. And that's the best feedback in the world. So I started doing more and more of that. And obviously, whenever I've done challenges, I've always raised money for charity. With mental health, it's been there from the start. Anxiety as a kid, then depression when I was 16. I had an eating disorder for 8 years. That kicked off around when I was about 16 as well, when I couldn't run for a year. And I kind of consider myself as recovered, but it's something, it's an ongoing process. And as you mentioned, we're all going through stuff. We all have challenges. We're always having peaks and troughs. The idea that life's meant to be happy and plain sailing and unicorns is a myth. But more and more, it kind of started to affect me. And the outdoors has always been my way of dealing with that. That's been my toolkit. It's been my kind of antidepressant. So I wanted to help more people to access that. But before I got to that point, for many years, like you said, I was one of those people that suffered in silence. I was this adventurer. I was this athlete. I was supposed to be mentally tough. And there's something different about depression and an eating disorder that I didn't want to talk about. And eventually I did go for help. And I remember reading a story about it was a marathon runner, very similar to me, who had the same problem. And he'd openly talked about it in a newspaper article. I remember seeing all the comments in the article and people say, "Oh my God, thank you so much. I thought I was the only one." And that's when I started to wonder whether I could have the same effect on people. That had given me the courage to ask for help. So how could I do that as well? It took many years, to feel comfortable to be able to stand in front of 100, 300 people in a room and talk about it. Now I do it like I'm just talking about, the forecast, or, talking about, my dog. It's that common to me now, which sometimes is a problem, because sometimes you've got to be careful about boundaries and not oversharing. I'm totally comfortable now to tell, 500 people about bulimia and anxiety and depression, when the first time I told anybody, I broke down into tears. So it's not an overnight process, but it is that case of people see adventure and sport as this strength, this pinnacle of achievement. People need to see that actually I still have the same stuff too. And that breaks down this myth about it being, strength, about it being a problem with a person. And that's why I talk about it, because I don't want other people to feel as alone as I did.
Man, just again, you continue to impress, Alex. And I mean, kudos to you. Obviously, your family, amazing young man. You really are. And you touched on something there that it's something that's always interested me, especially when I think about resiliency, mental toughness, things like that. I did my own post before, my own somewhat of a talk about resiliency before, about how the image of resiliency and mental toughness we seem to have is probably not, it's that tough side of it, that gritty side of it. And I think we miss sometimes on that. There's people out there who you may not look at them and think, wow, this person is so mentally tough, so resilient, right? But obviously at first, when I first see you, that would never come across immediately to me. But God, when I hear you speak, when I read some of the things you've done, you are definitely one of the most resilient and mentally tough human beings I've ever had the pleasure of speaking to. And I've had a decent amount of people on the show now, so I hold you in extremely high regard, Alex. You are definitely right up there with the, the toughest of the tough, and I say that in a good way, and kudos to you. So I wanted to end with this. You mentioned it a little bit. So as far as your future, your adventures, you mentioned possibly going back to Everest. Is there anything that you have in the works, anything that really is exciting to you that you wanted to talk about, that you may have upcoming that we could follow along with?
Sure. I think just on your last point, that's really kind of you. I certainly wouldn't have described myself as that resilient. I see all the flaws, but I think if resilience is about being vulnerable and keeping on showing up, then sure, I'd like to fit the bill. But that's kind of you. To your next question around what's next, always the question, isn't it? Because people always want to know. They always want to know what else you've come up with. But to throw a bit of a curveball to the story, about a year ago, I ran my longest run to date, which was called the Lakes, Meres and Waters, which is about 105 miles around the Lake District. 2 days later, I caught COVID. And since then, I've been on this really rubbish expedition with long COVID, and just the worst challenge of my life, because there's no process, there's no protocol. Nobody really knows what's going on. Any attempt to run or train was just lead to crashes of symptoms and relapses. So it's just been a chronic cold pretty much for a year. And mentally, that's obviously had its challenges, because when you rely on the outdoors, obviously you've got to quickly find something else to fill the gap. So since then, I discovered wild swimming and open water, and that was my way of kind of keeping my mental health afloat. And I'm pleased to say that I'm now finally getting back into running. Literally had to go back to couch to 5K. That was where I went back to, from doing 100 miles to couch to 5K. But fortunately, health seems to be kind of improving at long last. At times, I never thought it would, and I'm not out of the woods yet. So probably an unconventional approach to this, but I've just signed up for an expedition to Argentina, in December, to climb Aconcagua, which is the highest peak in South America. So not the highest I've been. I didn't mention I went to an expedition on Choa in Tibet in 2016, where I got to about 7,200. That's my highest point. So Aconcagua was a bit lower, but it's a way of getting back into the high altitude game. It gets me away, over the holidays period. I think I go over Christmas and New Year, and I find that a really challenging time of year for eating wise, for stress wise, and also it's a quiet time for work. So perfect time to go. So I get to escape Christmas, which is a bonus. But with all the time last year, not being able to run, not being able to set challenges, having to cancel races and challenges and all these things, and really having to do a lot of work on who am I? That's stuff you just want to kind of put in a box. It got me really thinking about the hills in the long term, and yeah, Everest may be on the cards again, because it'll be 10 years since the avalanche, and there's something in me there burning away, and you kind of can't ignore that. You really can't. So I've really had to sort of lower the bar a bit. Sometimes the challenge is, accepting where you are right now. But I'm excited about that, and I've got some smaller plans in the summer as kind of a comeback project. So yeah, making a comeback is the goal for this year. Comebacks are kind of what I do best. I kind of enjoy those. And in our charity, we've just hired a CEO in February. So he's now on board. He's flying. The charity's really busy. So I can hopefully step away from that a bit more and focus on kind of raising money and getting out there. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at the moment. So I guess watch the space.
Yeah, I'm excited to follow along, and really looking forward to what's in store for you. And Alex, honestly, not just as an adventurer, really looking forward to watching your continued growth as a person, because to me, first and foremost, especially being a little bit older than you, being a parent, I kind of I look at you and I see a person who has just overcome a lot and who is absolutely thriving and continuing to thrive. And that you know, and I think you mentioned it before. I even said something similar before in something I wrote about, not everyone can climb Mount Everest, but everybody needs an Everest in their life. And you've had plenty of Everests. And regardless of if you get back to Everest, if you never make it to the top of Everest, to me, I think you've already summited in life, my friend. And I nothing but respect for you and what you've done. And I wish you nothing but the best in all of your future endeavors. So, is there a website or anything you have in the works that people could pay closer attention?
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, obviously, thank you for the kind words. If I can share anything I've learned, if I can help anybody anyway, that's an open invitation. I've had some great coaches and mentors who've helped me get to where I am. So if I can pay that forward, then yeah, I'd love to hear from people. And thank you again for giving us a chance to share our stories. That I know that takes a lot of work as well. So thank you for that. If people want to follow me, my website is probably the best place to go. It's just alexstaniforth.com. I'm on all the usual places: Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. Again, if you just search my name or there on the website. And the charity, that's mindovermountains.org.uk. If people want to find out more. Obviously, that's only in England and Wales at the moment. Maybe we'll go international one day. But yeah, that's there as well. So I love to hear from people.
Great, fantastic, and I love the Mind Over Mountains. I think that's a great way to end this. So, Alex, thank you so much, and as always, thank you everyone for tuning in. I think Alex is a great example of a resilient person and someone we can all look to emulate, regardless of age. So, thanks everyone again, and I wish everyone the best with your own Everest. So thank you all, and thank you, Alex. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
This has been the Bear Essentials. Thanks for listening, and remember, never hibernate on your goals.